Okay, I'm here. Right, so this is day 8. I forget there's a bit of a storm when it comes on, but I'm getting there. So basically, I'm continuing reading the Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. And I've been talking about this. And if you know anybody out there who suffers from flashbacks, which is part of a response to early childhood trauma and sexual abuse, violence, or sadness on such a deep level that they, from childhood, that they have issues as adults, then please share. I'm also going to continue through the month of May for about 10 or 15 minutes a night to get online, because I do know that there are people out there who need to hear this information. The Complex PTSD book, Pete Walker from Surviving to Thriving, was my turning point as an adult, coming from abuse myself that went on for many, many years as a child. And day 8 of 31 days, because I'm going to do this throughout May. And what I would say is there are 13 chapters to the book, Complex PTSD book that I've just shown you. And it's my intention to help other people, and that to get to the point that we understand that complex PTSD is not so much a disorder, but it's a response to events in childhood that have not been dealt with. And as adults, we then have responses which are called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And we might use a couple of those responses. They're normal responses that we have in life. But what happens is that when we've had childhood trauma, we're stuck in one or two of the responses, or we overuse one or two of those responses to normal circumstances where we feel fearful or afraid. Then we have the idea is that we need to eliminate the inner critic, and that inner critic is the voice in our head that tells us that there's something wrong with us, that we're ugly, that we're stupid, that that we've got to forgive people that abused us. It tells us all sorts of things that are not real, and that will halt our healing. So the inner critic has to go. And I below on these YouTubes, I have been putting the links to the 14 steps to deal with the inner critic and the 13 steps, tips for flashbacks, how to deal with them. And what else I can tell you? So basically, as we begin to healthy anger and healthy blame, which in spirituality, that's not basically something that we're advised to do, or in life by authority figures. People say, oh, don't blame people and stuff like that. And that's not useful for people that have been through childhood trauma. And then when we can grieve fully, and that can take a couple of years of conscious grieving to get to the point where we've no longer got this inner critic going on, or when we get it, we knock it out the way immediately. We just go, no, I'm not listening to that rubbish. Then we get rid of toxic shame by being able to verbally ventilate. It's a very important aspect to it as well. When we can verbally ventilate, we get to this point of releasing the toxic shame that society, it's not that anybody's doing anything to anybody, but there are a set of beliefs in the consensus reality that tells us that we have to feel a particular way about things or think a particular way about things. And often people suggesting forgiveness and stuff like that have not been through sexual abuse or years of child abuse. So it's not that people are being, probably being cruel when they say these things, but it can, when you're on the receiving end of it as a trauma, having been through trauma, then it can feel like it's an attack, and that can make us act out. I've been through that myself many times. Then I'm going to read from the book. That's it. And then I'm going to go for chapter 1, because this is going to simplify. The last few days I was on chapter 9 that I was looking at. So chapter 1 here, I'm going to not start from the beginning of the book, because I'm not reading the whole book. I'm going to take sections over the next so many days, a section from the book, and read it. So here Pete Walker explains the definition of complex PTSD. And he says, CPTSD is a more severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from this better-known trauma symbol by 5 of its most common and troublesome features: emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, and a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. So I'm just going to stop there and just say that if we consider that people who've been through severe childhood trauma and are now adults, and a lot of people I know in their late 40s and 50s personally, who are dealing with the aftermath of early abuse, are having these issues of emotional flashbacks. They feel toxic shame. They're at self-abandonment, which means that they find it very difficult to get on day to day, and a vicious inner critic and social anxiety. So there can be a lot of being on our own when, you know, we're not integrating because of these situations. Pete Walker goes on to say, emotional flashbacks are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of CPTSD. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptible to painful emotional flashbacks, which, unlike PTSD, do not typically have a visual component. So the thing is, with complex PTSD, it's a lot to do with our feelings and, you know, things that we're thinking rather than a visual event. Emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused and abandoned child. These feeling states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight-flight instinct. So I'm going to assume, but I'm going to say it, fight-flight is where we go into a reaction to a thought, or maybe it could be a smell, you know, like a scent, or it could be the way somebody's tone of voice, or it could be something that we're just flashing back to. I hope that makes sense. He goes on to say, it is important to state here that emotional flashbacks, like most things in life, are not all or none. Flashbacks can range in intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end, where they devolve into what many therapists call a regression. And I've experienced that in 2016. I went into a flashback regression, and it literally wiped out months of my life. It was a really hard time for me, and it affected a lot of other things in my life. It had a huge knock-on effect. So finally, he says, finally, a more clinical and extensive definition of CPTSD can be found on page 121 of Judith Herman's seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. So I bought that book last week from Amazon, and I'm going to dip into that, but I don't know if I'll be reading that one publicly. But personally, myself, I'm going to look at Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery book. Going on, he says, here is an example of an emotional flashback. So he says, as I write this, I recall the first emotional flashback I was ever able to identify, although I did not identify it until about 10 years after it occurred. At the time of the event, I was living with my first serious partner. The honeymoon phase of our relationship came to a screeching halt when she unexpectedly started yelling at me for something I no longer recall. What I do vividly recall was how the yelling felt. It felt like a fierce, hot wind. I felt like I was being blown away, like my insides were being blown out, as a flame on a candle is blown out. Later, when I first heard about auras, I flashed back to this and felt my aura had been completely stripped from me. At the time, I also felt completely disorientated, unable to speak, respond, or even think. I felt terrified, shaky, and very little. Somehow I managed to totter to the door and get out of the house, where I eventually slowly pulled myself together. As I said earlier, it took me 10 years to figure out that this confusing and disturbing phenomenon was an intense emotional flashback. Some years later, I came to understand the nature of this type of regression, and I realized it was a flashback to the hundreds of times my mother, in full homicidal visage, blasted me with her rage into terror, shame, disassociation, and helplessness. So it's a big thing that we have to overcome. And a lot of people won't realize that we're going through flashbacks and anxiety. And a lot of people who are having anxiety also don't touch in that it can be to do with complex PTSD. Continuing reading. He says emotional flashbacks are also accompanied by intense arousals of the fight flight instinct, along with hyperarousal of the sympathetic nervous system, the half of the nervous system that controls arousal and activation. When fear is the dominant emotion in a flashback, the person feels extremely anxious, panicky, or even suicidal. And when despair predominates, a sense of profound numbness, paralysis, and desperation to hide may occur. A sense of feeling small, young, fragile, powerless, and helpless is also commonly experienced in an emotional flashback, and all symptoms are typically overlaid with a humiliating and crushing toxic shame. So the more we dig into understanding complex PTSD and what it's doing to us, and as we develop and grow and we start talking to our inner critic who shames us for even having a flashback, like, what's wrong with me? I should be over this right now. These are things that we hear from society. And what I found that most people that've been through childhood trauma, they've never had time to grieve it as an adult. So it means that through not being able to grieve what was a huge loss, abandonment, and betrayal, because many people who've been abused as children have actually not been parented, they've not been nurtured, and they've not been given love. So healthy blame and healthy anger, and that's not about attacking people, it's about having a healthy sense of self. And that when we begin to get that, we're working in line with our inner critic, which then means we begin to tell our inner critic to bugger off, so to speak. Heavy words, but that's what I've told it to do. And now when I dip into my inner critic who wants to annihilate me, it doesn't stay there very long. I snap out of it really quickly, which stops me from going into flashbacks. And the less flashbacks that I've had, the healthier my body has felt. Like I used to have a lot of autoimmune stuff, little issues, always at the doctor, something wrong with me. And now that's beginning to ease off. So I hope this information is helpful. I can see 3 people watching. I don't know if anybody's got any questions that you've got or not, but you can also email me. I think some people on such videos such as this, they don't want to write comments in the comments box because of the nature of what complex PTSD is related to. So I do put my email below the video when it's uploaded properly. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow with day 9 and read a bit from chapter 2 of Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. Thank you.